Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of You Are My Boro with myself, Scott Wilson, and Dom Shaw from the Northern Echo. Everything all right, Dom?
Yeah, I'm sound, mate. Yourself?
International break ready? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I
you've
think
got
so.
the big one. You've got the big one on Friday night.
England Malta. I mean, games do not get much bigger than Malta at home when you've already qualified at a probably wet Wembley. It's going to be wonderful.
Will it be a sellout?
I think they're talking about it being nearly. It's still outrageous, the crowds they're getting at Wembley. I mean, I think England should play around the country way more than they do. I absolutely agree with that fundamentally. But I understand why the FA still having Wembley to pay for. They're reluctant to do it when they can get 80, 90,000 in for a game against Malta on a Friday night. I mean, it's pretty staggering, really, isn't it? Even if they end up getting 60, 70,000 in, that's still an extraordinary crowd for a game like that, really. But I guess, I don't know, I think there's still a lot of kind of, families, kids getting their first look at Wembley, all that kind of stuff, which, you'd think that would kind of exhaust itself eventually. But I think there's still a novelty in kind of taking your kids to an England game and stuff like that, which I guess is good. But yeah, it's going to be a bit of a grind on Friday night, I think. What wasn't a grind was the weekend.
Well, I was going to say Sam Greenwood outrageously overlooked by Gareth Southgate after his first games.
Yeah, well, we're going to have a chat about the weekend, which will inevitably lead us into Mr. Greenwood and his wand of a foot. So we'll have a chat on that. We'll have a bit of a talk about the break and what Boro have coming up after it. And that might very well then lend itself to a bit of an early look at January and what might or might happen there. Just before we start properly, thanks as ever for watching and supporting us on these. If you are watching it on the YouTube channel, then please comment, like, subscribe. If you're listening to it on one of the podcast platforms, then rate and review. And as I say, thanks very much for watching and listening and supporting. So, Dom, let's get straight to it. The Riverside, Saturday afternoon, Leicester City. A proper game, wasn't it? A proper game between two good championship sides. I think we both agree on that. I think everyone will agree on that. And obviously, Boro coming out on top. I mean, now that the kind of dust settled, what are your key takeaways from it?
Well, when you say there about it being a proper game, Michael Carrick said that he'd said to the players exactly that at half time. He'd gone in laughing and said, you're in a proper game today, boys, type thing. And Leicester were a proper team. You could see why they were top of the league. You could see why. I think everyone agrees that they're going to go up and probably going to go up as champions. And it was only just over a week ago that they were talking about kind of breaking all records on the way, really, weren't they? And then obviously they've suffered those successive 1-0 defeats. I think it was Michael Carrick's best win as Boro boss for two reasons. I think, firstly, Leicester's aforementioned form, the fact that I know we only talked last week about the fact that in recent weeks they have shown that there's chinks in their armour, and Sunderland ran them close, QPR ran them close, and then they lost to Leeds. But they are top, and they were 11 points clear of third place going in to Saturday's game. And you only have to look at the squad and the bench. I mean, the bench on Saturday, which we touched on last week, had the likes of Vardy. Yeah. All of those players who were on the bench would walk into any. Connor Cody was in the England squad until very, very recently. Yeah. Souttar's a £15 million defender. You could go on. So clearly that in itself makes it a big win. I think the second reason why it was so impressive and probably the best win of Carrick's tenure is the manner in which Boro won the game, and the fact that they did have to veer away from the usual approach, and yet they executed the game plan to perfection, really. How many times have we seen Boro dictate and dominate possession against teams? And yet, after 15 minutes on Saturday when I looked, Leicester had 79% of the ball. I think the mental stress of chasing a team, such a talented team around like that for 90 minutes and not making a costly mistake. Had Boro held on for a 0-0 draw, it would have been a game plan brilliantly planned and executed. The fact they then took the chance because of the moment of magic laid on, just capped it off. So I think really it's the perfect way to send Boro into the international break on a high, and it tees them up nicely now for that busy spell to come, doesn't it?
Yeah, which we will get to in a second. I mean, you touched on it there, the kind of tactical shift, if you like. And would it be fair that last season, one of the probably very few criticisms you could maybe level at Carrick was that he didn't do enough of that, that in, the big games, the playoff semi-finals being the obvious examples, that he kind of stuck rigidly to what Boro had been doing all season, even though by that stage he didn't necessarily have the personnel he would want and the game wasn't necessarily going the way he wanted. So, is this a big moment in terms of Carrick proving that he can adapt, he can set up a team differently, he can take the opposition by surprise, if you like, and he can veer away from what he'd probably ideally like to do because of the circumstances of a specific game?
Yeah, I think so. Our Northern, I'd love to credit this point myself, but our Echo colleague Nick Gullen said to me yesterday that looked back at that Burnley game last year when Boro probably tried to play their own game against Burnley. You were top of the league in away and gone at the time, and I wasn't at that game, but the really taught a bit of a football lesson. Really, Burnley were just better at what they did. And then you look at that Coventry game. I don't necessarily think Boro clearly for that second leg weren't going to change their approach for that game. But in the last half an hour or so of that game, it felt like something maybe a bit different was required. If I remember rightly, Mark Robbins stuck an extra man in the midfield for the second leg, didn't he? And won that midfield.
Got the grips with that, yeah.
Yeah. So I think both of those games, when you look back on and now look at this, you look at Burnley in the Premier League this season and the way they're trying to approach games, that there comes a time for all football managers will have a philosophy and a way they want to play. You will come up against teams who are better than you at that. So if you play that way, which plays into the hands of that better team, then really you're asking for trouble. So I think it was a massive tick and a massive win for Michael Carrick. Now, inevitably, he pointed the praise elsewhere afterwards and talked about it was the coaching team who I'll credit the coaching team for coming up with a plan and the players for executing it. But that is clearly on Michael Carrick, and that, as if he'd made a selection decision or a tactical decision that had gone wrong, he'd no doubt be to blame. I think when it goes planned like that, you have to credit the head coach for it.
A couple of individual performances that I wanted to kind of flag up and discuss. Dale Fry and Johnny Howson, two players who I think we would say have been absolutely integral to Boro for the best part of half a decade now, really. But perhaps haven't either of them been at their absolute best for at least parts of this season. I mean, Howson obviously hasn't necessarily played every game. Fry, in fairness, has kind of chopped and changed defensive partners a little bit. But if that's the case, then they were right back on it at the weekend, weren't they? I mean, Dale Fry, magnificent at centre-half, and Howson just doing what Johnny Howson does when he's at his absolute best, which is disrupting everything that Leicester tried to do creatively in that kind of pocket behind the forward. Yeah,
and disrupting Keenan Dewsbury Hall, because Howson didn't leave Dewsbury Hall alone, and Fry didn't leave Iheanacho alone. And Enzo Maresca afterwards, it was put to him that was Boro's man marking a new experience for them, and he said it was a new experience, but he felt that they'd overcome it and paid the price for missed chances, which I thought really was doing Boro a bit of a disservice, because Howson kept Dewsbury Hall quiet and in his pocket for the most part. Iheanacho had two big chances, but both of them came from Boro's mistakes. The first time Isaiah Jones pass back was cut out, and the second time Dieng tried to overplay it a little bit, but then Dieng made amends for it. It was definitely Fry's best, both of them. It was both best performance of the season. It was as good as I've seen Fry for a long time, and I think it's credit to Fry and McNair. And I know this comes on the back of conceding 3 goals at Plymouth last week, but Darragh Lenihan is a stick-on when he's in the team, isn't it? And you can say the same for the attacking players, Greenwood, which we'll talk about, and Jones as well, with Force on the right. It's credit to the players who are in the team that the absence of 3 major players hasn't been as sorely felt as what you'd have expected to be the case. Because if we'd have said 2 months ago, give me two players who Boro really can't afford to lose, then certainly Lenihan and McGree would have been right in the mix, wouldn't they?
I know. Yeah. And it kind of carries on the straight. I mean, Boro have clearly improved an awful lot since that first month and a half of the season. They've got an awful lot better. A lot of the issues that were there early on have been ironed out. But they are seen to be performing better in the big games against the big teams. And if you look at the table, now, admittedly, QPR, they played very early. Coventry, they played very early. But it's the teams in that bottom 6 or 7 that they've dropped the points, isn't it? Their record against the top teams in the league so far this season has actually been really good.
I mean, you look at Sheffield Wednesday at the bottom and think, how didn't Boro beat
another one,
Sheffield Wednesday? And yet, that second half performance at Sheffield Wednesday, for some reason, whatever was said or whatever was done was clearly the turning point, wasn't it? Because for all Carrick looks back at those early weeks and months and says that he always knew it was coming, I don't think the general fan base felt quite as confident as the head coach.
Not at half time, anyway.
Because the performances weren't great at all, were they, in the early weeks of the season? And even now, how do you reflect then on this chunk of games? Because starting with Birmingham, so let's have a look at them. So obviously Birmingham was the first game back after the international break. Then it was Norwich away, which obviously Boro won 2-1. Defeat at home to Stoke, a victory at Exeter in the Carabao Cup, the draw at Plymouth, and the victory over Leicester. Despite that defeat to Stoke and the draw at Plymouth, but in the last international break, Boro were 4 points off the top 6. Now the 2. They've helped themselves into the last 8 of the Carabao Cup, where they're going to play League One Port Vale. This has been a hugely encouraging and positive chunk of games, really, hasn't it? Despite those defeats and despite that defeat and the Plymouth draw and the injuries.
I was just going to say, despite the absences, I mean, the Stoke game the more you look at that Stoke game, the more it just feels like one of those games that you're going to get as a championship team where it just doesn't quite happen for you. Unless you're an exceptionally good team like Burnley were last season and are going to run away with the league, you're just not going to win 6, 7, 8, 9 games in a row in the championship. You're not really going to stay unbeaten for that length of time either. It's incredibly hard to do. So I think in every block like this between international breaks, you're probably going to get a game where it doesn't really happen. That clearly was the Stoke game. The Plymouth game was a bit different. It was a bit helter-skelter. It obviously came in a week when Boro were doing a hell of a lot of travelling. I think you probably, you give them a pass for that and say, okay, maybe 2 drop points, but certainly not a disaster. In and around that, hugely encouraging, like you say. Birmingham comfortable. Exeter, a real ding-dong, cracking cup tie. Boro get through on the right side of it and get a fantastic draw. And then you beat the league leaders. So, it's been a big month. It feels like what it's done is it's built on the progress that was made in the last chunk before the last international break. And it's ensured that momentum hasn't been lost. In fact, if anything, it's got even greater. And as you say, what you're starting to see now is 3 or 4 probably of the kind of summer arrivals really bedding in and kind of, making a name for themselves. So Greenwood, the obvious one, Vandenberg, clearly Dieng had already done that in fairness, but, absolutely it's a top class championship goalkeeper. So, and they've proved they can cope, as you say, with the absence of 2 or 3 key players who you would have potentially thought, okay, if they're out for the whole of that chunk, then that's a worry. So I think Michael Carrick will look back on it with an awful lot of satisfaction and feel that now there are some really, really solid foundations in place that Boro can build from through Christmas and into the new year.
We're going to, in our second Vision pod later this week, we're going to touch on the signings and give our verdict on the signings so far and how they've performed and our thoughts on them so far. But got to talk about Greenwood on the back of that goal on Saturday.
Be honest, you were there. When he stepped up, were you thinking, right, here we go? Or were you thinking, behave yourself?
Well, so he had a free kick earlier in the second half. So he had a free kick earlier in the second half. And it was right on the edge. And Carrick said afterwards he thought that was too close, and we were laughing. I was sat next to Anthony Vickers and Craig Johns from the Gazette, and we were laughing, saying, you know, when we went to Sam Greenwood's unveiling in the summer, he was telling us he's kind of a free kick expert, a free kick specialist.
Yeah.
It writes itself if he scores here. Sam Greenwood, good to his words. Sam Greenwood, true to his words. Sam Greenwood sticks to his promise, sort of thing. And then he hits the wall. So we're all kind of laughing, saying, well, there's the idea gone. It looked too far out for me, the second one. And Hermanson, that in goal for Leicester, had been excellent. So it had to be perfect from that distance to beat that keeper, didn't it?
And it was, wasn't it?
It was. And I mean, the good thing was, obviously, it was Greenwood that was fouled and the ball went out to Engel on the left. And the referee should have played the advantage, and he didn't. And Carrick, throughout the game, Carrick was as exasperated as I'd seen him with officials. And he was furious that the advantage wasn't played. And most of the 30,000 was, but I didn't have the heart afterwards to say, Michael, should the referee have played the advantage in the to the winning goal? Yeah, it's a great goal, isn't it? It's a great hit.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant. I mean, you just don't hit them better than that. You really don't. And like you say, you know, he's always kind of claimed to have it in his locker. And in fairness, a couple of Leeds lads who I know and are pretty good friends with, when he came, said, well, you know, he can't necessarily do this, that, or the other, but he can hit a set piece. And we hadn't really seen it up until then, had we? But my goodness, it was a belter. Yeah, it really was.
And the fear in the summer when Akpom and Ramsey and Archer and the likes went was, where are your match winners? And Greenwood's stepping up and showing himself to be one now, isn't he? Because Carrick's made clear that he was injured, or he had been injured when he came in. He wasn't 100%. He wasn't fit. He wasn't sharp. But in this chunk of games, he's established himself as something of a talisman, really, hasn't he?
Well, I mean, at the minute now, you know, clearly when he gets back, he's been out for a long time now, and he'll have to work his way back in. But at the minute, would you play McGree ahead of him? I'm not sure I would. The way Greenwood play.
No, I don't. I can't remember.
I know they're slightly different players,
but they were making the case for, if everyone's fit, would you have McGree on the left and move Greenwood into the 10 role?
Yeah.
And then there's Force and Jones on the right. I mean, Carrick suddenly has those options that, whereas at the start of the season, the kind of team was bouncing around because Borough weren't getting results and performances. Now there's real decisions. Morgan Rogers has taken his chance of late, hasn't he? He was excellent at Exeter, good off the bench against Birmingham, and yet Carrick really just hasn't had the chance to play him in the league games.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it'll be interesting. Again, I know we're jumping ahead of ourselves here, and there'll be players potentially coming back fit, but I think it'll be interesting what Carrick does at Port Vale.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
because that's talking quarter-final territory here, and a winnable quarter-final at that. Now, you know, I think Glover will play. I think he'll probably stick to his idea of changing his keepers through the tournament. That's fine. You know, a lot of teams do that. But will we see 7-8 changes at Port Vale? That's an interesting one. That's an interesting one.
My inclination is to do it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say there is an argument that the likes of Rodgers and Latalath and Silvera have earned the right to have it a go because of every way they've played in the round so far. Yeah, definitely. But you know, if Greenwood's flying in the way that he is, and if Coburn's, you know, continuing to kick on and progress, would you leave them out of that game? I think that'll be a really interesting one. Break now, anyway. I mean, what are Borough's kind of what are the priorities in the break? I mean, obviously, a bit of rest for the players who have been doing it. In an ideal world, hopefully, we'd see a bit of progress in terms of Lenihan, McGree, Force, and getting them back. I mean, is that, you know, it'll be interesting come the end of the international break where those players are, because they're not kind of, you know, even knocking on the door of being back then you would start to worry for what exactly is going on with those three, wouldn't you?
I think what you'd hope for, because when you go to Bristol City after the break, chances are it's going to be an unchanged team. You've just beaten the league leaders and the favourites to win the title. But I think if at the end of next week, Lenihan, Force, and McGree are not yet back in training, then you kind of then you're thinking, well, are we going to see him before Christmas, really, aren't you? Because you're at the end of November and they're still not back in training. Now there's clearly a lot of games. I think there's 10 games between Bristol City and the end of December. But we don't know really anything much about the injuries, do we? So it's hard to. We know McGree's obviously plantar fascia, but other than that, when you kind of don't know what you're dealing with, it's hard to know how long they're going to be out for, or what the expectation is for when they might be back.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a bit anecdotal, this, because obviously we cover Sunderland and Newcastle. Newcastle have horrendous injury issues going on at the minute, but I have a feeling at the minute that if you look across various leagues, and I know I'm probably edging a bit more Premier League here than necessarily Championship and Borough specific, but there does seem to be a hell of a lot of players out with kind of muscular injuries that either keep reoccurring, or players who were going to be out for a little while and then all of a sudden they're out for 3 months. And, I don't want to keep banging the drum here for this overworked footballers, but it does seem to be an issue, and certainly it has been an issue for Borough this season with injuries that at the first, the first kind of appearance seemed fairly innocuous, and the soundings we were getting was that they were fairly innocuous, but actually they haven't really turned out that way.
Well, I thought I'd read something, and I've just double-checked myself, double-checked now. There was a piece I read at the end of last week that at the weekend, more than 30 Premier League players were missing with hamstring injuries, purely with hamstring injuries.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen by coincidence, does it? That doesn't happen by chance. Now, why it is it because the game's so much faster and more dynamic these days? Is it the knock-on effect 2 years on of COVID and the lack of a break between seasons and the players just never really having chance to recover? I don't know. It's because if it was one team, then you'd say, like, clearly they're not, their pre-season preparation, their pre-season plan hasn't been designed well enough. They're not conditioned enough. But for it to happen across the league shows that there's something at play. There's definitely something at play.
I mean, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting this is anywhere the case with McGree, Force, or Lenihan. I'm sure it absolutely isn't. But Tony Mowbray is interested on this up at Sunderland, because he is adamant nowadays player scans are so good and so detailed that they will pick up issues that then kind of get into players' heads, and that medical staff feel they can't take a risk with, that 20, 30, 40 years ago just would never have been picked up or thought about. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 second we should go back to the 70s and 80s when players will be out concussed and they'd get up and patch something on their head and off we go. Or, players are thrown out there with muscular injuries where they're clearly not fit and clearly not right and do long-term damage. I'm not suggesting that at all, but I do wonder if there is something in the fact that nowadays scans are so kind of good and so detailed that the slightest of issue is picked up, and then there's a need to be much more cautious than maybe you would have been. I don't know. I think that's an interesting one. Mowbray certainly thinks there's something in that.
Yeah, that is an interesting. And there's got to be clearly it's not horses for courses, isn't it? And there isn't a blanket issue across the board. Riley McGree, for example, we've talked about it, haven't we? Plantar fasciitis. One of my mates has had it bad in the past, and it is one of those troublesome injuries, isn't it? That is hard to get the bottom of, and it's not like a ruptured Achilles or a broken leg where you say, right, you need to do 3 months of this and then 4 months of that. I don't know. It's an interesting one, and it'll be interesting, I think, to see how it progresses across the course of the season, because the more it happens, especially in the Premier League, I think the more managers are going to start speaking out about it, aren't they? Because if they've got their best players out, look at Ange Postecoglou at Tottenham, for example, and all the players he's got out at the minute. Now, Postecoglou, I think, is the one manager who won't twist.
Might not.
But
some of them getting themselves sent off, that would be a start for him.
Yeah.
Keeping 11 players on the field might be a start for Spurs.
Yeah,
We've digressed here. We've digressed a bit. Let's get back on track. Let's get back to Borough. January. I mean, we're not far off now, are we? A month and a half. I mean, what do you? I think the expectation is or has been that they will probably try to get a striker in, because obviously Coburn and Lath have dovetailed really nicely in the last month or so, but there's not an awful lot of options beyond that. I think we probably have felt that it's likely to be a Premier League loan potentially, because you feel that that's probably Borough's best route to a player who can come in and make a real difference in the second half of the season. Do you think that will remain the priority, and where else do you think they might be looking?
I think that's probably the one area, like you say, where you look and you're one injury or suspension or real lack of form away from being left very short there, aren't you? If Lath got injured, for example, and we touched on this last week, and then you've got, as well as Coburn's done, a 20-year-old playing his first full season of Championship football as your only recognised centre forward, then clearly that's an issue. And I think, again, as we touched on last week, in January, your Premier League low knee is, for all Boro have clearly moved away, as we've seen this year, we've got evidence of this year, and especially with the Greenwood deal, that they've moved away from the position they were in last year, where they've got a handful and more of low knees. In January, that is your best chance. Unless you have unearthed an absolute gem from overseas, that is your best chance of bringing in real game-changing quality for the second half of the season, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think, we saw that with Archer last year, didn't we? If a player became available, the Boro would not have been able to sign permanently. So, be interesting to see if that happens. What about the other way? So, it's normally at this time of year that you start getting a little bit nervous about your prize asset. Clearly, that's Hayden Hackney at the minute. I mean, do we think that there's any risk of a Premier League big boy coming in for Hackney? I mean, I think it's a pretty open secret that scouts from some of the real biggest Premier League teams have been watching him quite regularly this season. I've heard Liverpool, I've heard Spurs. Do we think that there's kind of any chance of Boro being forced into a decision there? I think it's probably 6 months too early, will be my view on it. I could see Premier League clubs having a real good look at Hackney in the summer. I'd be surprised if any of them made a real move in January. I think it's, he still hasn't had a real full season of being a Championship player on the belt, has he?
No, that was what I was going to say. He strikes me as, I think, the type of player he is. It's not like he's a centre forward who's absolutely tearing up the Championship. Or, for example, Jack Clark up the road at Sunderland. I could see Premier League clubs having a sniff at him in January. He was wanted in the summer. He's top of joint top of the goal scoring charts. He's the type of player you could see clubs having a sniff for in January. Hackney, having just signed a new contract, made it absolutely clear how happy he is here and how he feels like he's on the right track here. In Michael Carrick, he's got a head coach who gave him his opportunity. And I just think, from speaking to Hackney, I did that piece last year where I spoke to the coaches and managers who've worked with him in the past. So Graham Lee, who was with him with the under-21s, Neil Cox, who had him at Scunthorpe, Tony McMahon, who was the assistant manager at Scunthorpe, and they all talked about how much of a wise head Hackney has on his shoulders, but also that those around him have the player's best interest at heart. He's represented by a local agency. His dad follows him absolutely everywhere, going to watch him, and is his biggest fan, and it clearly has his best interest at heart. It doesn't strike me that anyone associated with Hackney will be agitating him and saying, you could get yourself, you could be in line for a Premier League move in January. Like, we all understand, don't we, that Hackney looks like a Premier League player in the making, and there will come a time where if Boro don't get there, like Tavernier, like Jed Spence, although he was a different sort of example, wasn't he? That every player's got a price, and if a huge bid lands at some point in the future, then clearly Boro have a decision to make. But I'd be amazed if Hackney. I'd be amazed if there was any real speculation about him leaving in January, not just about him going in January. And in terms of coming in, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, well, the other one that there might have to be more of a decision within January is probably McNair, isn't it? Just because of his contract situation. Now, I think that's a more interesting one because he's got 6 months left. If he's not Borough's highest paid player, he will be one of the top 2 or 3 just by dint of the time when he signed that contract and the kind of world Borough were operating in then. You'd be surprised if the Borough were keen to offer him a new long-term deal on those terms, because it's a different Borough now. It's a different financial model. It's a different, everything about the club, if you like, is different. So that then makes it a little bit awkward, doesn't it, if there is any interest in McNair in January? Because clearly, if you're not going to offer him a deal he's going to sign, then you're pretty near to a position when he's going to walk potentially for nothing in the summer. So I think that could be an interesting one in January.
And McNair is a player who was certainly attracted it. Well, there's really, over the course of the last couple of years, there's always been a little bit of McNair speculation in the back end, hasn't there? There's been a few clubs who've been linked: Leeds, Stoke, Luton in the summer. There's been, I think was there even talk of a club in Italy being interested in him in the summer, if I remember rightly. So I don't think it'd be a complete surprise if a club had a dabble at McNair in January. For all, clearly at the minute, McNair's playing for an in-form Borough side. And if he's one player where, I was going to say to you, we've talked about the centre forward position, but where else in the squad looks short? I'm not sure there's any real area that looks desperately short. But if, for example, McNair there was a decision to be made on McNair in January, I think you'd then have to bring someone in, wouldn't you? Centre half. Because, Van den Berg can play there. Matt Clark's coming back, but you're risking leaving yourself in the and
I think it's interesting because I think that if Borough were to make the decision that, okay, we're probably not going to offer a McNair a contract that he's going to sign, so if somebody comes in for him, okay, we probably will have a think about that. Then I don't think what you're wanting to do then is just bring someone in on a 6-month loan to plug a gap. I think if you're going to get rid of McNair, it's because you're feeling that money is going to be better invested in a young player who you believe in, who you can bring through and who can do a job for you over the course of the long-term contract, that you're not necessarily going to... Now, we're talking about McNair's contract situation. Clearly, Borough know all about McNair's contract situation. The one thing you would say about things at Rockcliffe at the minute is it does seem a far better, more harmonious, but also just better organised, much more developed recruitment operation than has maybe been the case in the past. So I'm absolutely sure that they'll have players earmarked that if something was to happen with McNair, that will be where Borough would go to. It'd be interesting to see what type of players they are, whether it's, another relatively unknown in the Van den Berg sense from overseas. Do they have a Lenihan identified who they think is ready-made in the Championship, who they could go and pluck and would go straight into that first team? I think it'd be an interesting one.
Yeah, and if you're looking at the other areas that Borough might look at and think, do they need work? Right back, for all, Van den Berg's been excellent there. He's a centre-half playing at right back. Does Tommy Smith's out for the season? I don't know. Well, I suspect not. But it's one of the areas where you look at and think they might be short than they are elsewhere. Left back, they've brought 2 left backs in the summer. Midfield, you've got House and Hackney and Barlassa battling for 2 spots, and Lewis O'Brien still to come back. But other than up front, I don't think Borough are desperately short anywhere, are they? And they're not desperately short up front. But I agree. You take the point there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if you think of the wide positions, well, if they get McGree and Force back, then they've got 4 there before we even think of your Silveras and your Rogerses and players like that. So no, I would definitely agree. I would think that attack is clearly the priority. Defensive, something happens. But no, apart from that, I don't think it'll be a busy January. Do you? A couple maybe, and that's probably going to be it.
I think last January, where So Barlaser was clearly a long-term target who they were able to get. I think, you know, the centre-half kind of scenario that you touched upon there, you could see that sort of thing, couldn't you? Other than that, the potential of a Premier League low-knee centre-forward, or perhaps they do have something up the sleeve with a centre-forward. What Boro did well in the summer was keep things under wraps, didn't they? You know, a lot of the deals didn't get out until the last minute, and that's rare, isn't it, in this game? I don't think. Again, I think gone are the days where Boro left kind of mainly because everyone's pulling in the same direction, and they haven't got a head coach in who's maybe got a different view to a previous head coach, so they're having to buy players to fit a different sort of model. Gone are the days now, really, in January, where you need to be scampering around looking for players, and fingers crossed, if Boro continue to progress in the manner that they've been playing the last couple of weeks and months, then they're going to be entering January from a position of strength again, aren't they, rather than kind of firefighting at the bottom of the division where you're thinking we desperately need a centre forward to get us out of trouble. Really, when you look back to the first international break and the picture then, if you'd have said we'd have been having this general 35, 36 minutes of conversation a couple of months on, it's credit to everyone involved, isn't it?
It's incredible, really. Yeah. And the change has been, you know, fantastic. And you know, I keep going back to it. We've said it on a number of these videos. I think you know, an awful lot of credit to Michael Carrick for not pressing the panic button and not trying to overthink things, because you see so many managers do it. And you know, for a manager in his first job, you know, pretty much going through his first really sticky spell, for Carrick to have ridden it out as kind of level-headed and impressively as he's done, it's a massive tick in the box for me. Like, it really is.
Yeah, and not, as we discussed at length, not kind of revert to, well, you know, I lost my best players, I've lost my centre forward, we've brought in young players who are still getting. There was none of it, was there? Absolutely none of it. Not even a hint of going down that path. And we kind of felt it. It's good. It's going to have to come in the end, but it just. No, there wasn't even a hint of it, was there?
So what's on the Dom Shaw agenda? Well, I know what you're doing for the rest of the day, because me and Dom had meetings in the office yesterday, and you've managed to doil up completely by leaving your laptop cable in the office. So you've got to shoot through there, haven't you?
Yeah, so I'm going there. And in another, we discussed this as well before, and didn't I? In another laptop development, the F key has come off my keyboard. So I was going to say, if you see typos in my copies, but if you see more typos in my copy, then it's still fried, and you know why.
F is literally off.
Well, yeah, I've managed to stick. Yeah, there it is again.
There we go.
It's like sticking back on, but it's very unsteady.
Yeah, that's not what you want.
No,
that's not what you want. Yeah, no
deal fried beef. It's not all glamour, this job, is it? Having to put up with no F's on the keyboard and going back to get my laptop lead. Yeah. How about yourself? You're not in North Macedonia next Monday, are you?
No, I'm not in North Macedonia. No, I've managed to avoid. I have been to Skopje before, actually. It's actually really nice. Not sure it'll be nice in the middle of November. It's got a lovely canal bit. It's actually quite a nice city, Skopje. But no, I'm not. What am I doing? I am down in London, actually. I'm off Thursday, and I'm down in London to see Jamie Webster.
Oh, class.
You aware of Mr. Webster class. And his Liverpudlian tunes? So
where's he playing?
Somewhere in Camden. Is it the Electric Ballroom that's in Camden? I think it might be there. It's somewhere in Camden. So that'll be I'm down with my brother-in-law. He lives down there. So I'm down with him. And he likes a bevy or two. So I think there'll be a little bit of ale supped on Thursday, and then wake up and do a bit of work and head to Wembley to sleep through the first half of England-Malta, and then wake up and write a match report, and then drive home through the night. So that'll be all right, won't it?
Oh, class. That'll be good. That'll be good, that gig, won't it?
I'm looking forward to that, actually, more than England-Malta. I shouldn't say that. Listen, I'm getting paid to watch football. It's not really a job, is it? But I'll remind you of that when I'm on the M1 in traffic at Luton at about midnight with 3 hours still to do to get up the road. That's always the best.
Well, at least the good thing about that is at least this time next week we can have a bit more service station chat and discuss where you stopped off on the way back from London.
We'll do that. We'll definitely do that. Yeah,
we'll be back. We're
right.
going to do another vid later in the week. We are going to discuss the summer signings, as we said, our kind of verdict on each of those. But as we say every week, if there's anything in particular you want us to discuss, then these international pauses are a great opportunity to do that. So just give us a shout on Twitter, or leave a comment in the comments section on YouTube, or get in touch with us via email, and we'll certainly add that to our list. But thanks for watching. Thanks for listening if you're listened on podcast, and we'll catch you later in the week.